My name's Tim. I'm the student minister here at Centerburg, and I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to get to know you guys, your students, and to work with you as parents, as families, and to work with your students. And I'm looking forward to it. And today, as we begin, I wanted to set the stage. I wanted to recap a little bit from last week. And we're in the week 2 of a 3-week series that we're doing on the book of Hosea. And we're looking at chapters 1, chapters 2, and chapters 3. Last week, Darren talked about chapter 1. And kind of the setting for this chapter is that Israel had forgotten who they were. They'd forgotten that they were the chosen nation by God. And in that, there's this thing called syncretism that Darren talked about, where people try to blend 2 different belief systems and make them one. And we see this all over the place in different settings. But Israel had done this. They started to take on some of the gods of other nations. These gods didn't require their allegiance, and so all of a sudden it just kind of became okay. And they started worshiping specifically this god called Baal. And Baal, as I understand it, it was a god that they worshiped because they thought Baal would bring them better produce from their crops, that their crops would produce more, and they thought that worshiping him would bring them better profits in return. All right? And so I get distracted by stools, sorry. And so they started worshiping Baal right alongside God. And here's the significant thing about worshiping Baal, is it's not just that they maybe prayed to a god or did something. To worship Baal, you had to go to the temple, and when you went to the temple, you had sex with a prostitute at the temple. That was how you worshiped Baal. All right? I saw somebody's eyebrows just raise, right? It's pretty it's striking. It's startling how it's like, how did they get there, right? And so in chapter 1 of Hosea, what God does is he goes to his prophet Hosea and he says, Hosea, I want you to marry Gomer. And Gomer is a prostitute in the temple of Baal. I want you to marry her. And that marriage is going to be an example of the nation of Israel and how they have betrayed me and committed adultery against me. So Hosea does what God calls him to do. He marries Gomer, and they have 3 children, and while it's stark, it's drastic, it stands out, there's also this sense of beauty with this marriage, because Hosea is calling Gomer out of this life of servitude, out of slavery, in a position where she's used and abused, and I can imagine the things she faced in that role. And he calls her out of that to a life where he's going to supply what she needs. He's going to sustain her. He's not going to use her and abuse her. He's going to love her. And he brings her out of a relationship that is broken into a relationship that is good and pure. And then they have three kids together, and it looks good. And then we get to Hosea 2, and it all falls apart. Gomer wanders. Hosea 2:2 says this, rebuke your mother, rebuke her, for she is not my wife and I am not her husband. Let her remove the adulterous look from her face and the unfaithfulness from between her breasts. Gomer has gone back to her old ways. For some reason, she didn't trust what Hosea had provided for her. So she took back control. And the only way she knew to take back control was to go back to her other lovers, to the people that she knew when she was a prostitute. And then in Hosea 2:5, we find this. It says, their mother has been unfaithful and conceived them in disgrace. She said, I will go after my lovers who give me my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. We find out that not only has Gomer wandered, but Hosea finds out that his kids aren't even his own, that his children aren't his own. And then there's other things we see in this, my food and my water, my wool and my linen, my olive oil and my drink. The food and water is symbolic of security. So she's saying these other lovers will give me the security I need. So I'm going to go after them because they'll give me the security. The wool and the flax, they equal status. So she's saying, I don't trust the status that Hosea is giving me. I'm going to take that and I'm going to control that, and I'm going to try to get status through these other lovers. And the last one, the oil and the drink, equate to the pleasures of life, the good things in life. And she's saying, I don't necessarily trust Hosea to provide those things for me, so I'm going to take control of this. And I'm going to trust myself to go after these other lovers and provide that for me. And here's the thing. All of those things, Hosea provided for Gomer. He gave them to her because he loved her. He gave them to her, but she still wandered. She wanted to control the source of those things, so she took it in herself to control them. The only way she knew to control it was to go back to the other lovers, and so she wandered. And here's the thing, like I said earlier, this whole picture feels really dramatic. You have God's people worshiping an idol in a way that is very startling and very drastic. And Hosea marrying a prostitute that's involved in that worship, which again is startling and dramatic and kind of makes you stand out and go, what? And then, on top of that, Gomer returns to that life. She doesn't trust the life Hosea has given her. That God called Hosea to marry Gomer, and then Gomer doesn't trust it. And so she goes back to her old ways of being used, of being abused, of being a slave to that life. She goes back to it. And while it's startling and dramatic, we can't just look at it and point a finger and be like, what were you thinking? Nation of Israel, it's so obvious, right? You were having sex with prostitutes to worship another god to bring you crops that God was going to provide for you if you just trusted. It seems so obvious. But we can't just read this and point the finger at Israel and at Gomer and at Hosea, because we do the same thing. We constantly wander. As a song said a minute ago, we are so prone to wander, to leave the God we love. Gomer left because she didn't trust the stability that Hosea provided, and she wanted to control the stability. She wanted to control what was going to happen. And I read this story and I wonder if for the Israelites at all, Baal stood out to them. If it seemed abnormal. If it seemed sinful, maybe. Because when we think about wandering away from God, I think what we often think of are the big things. The things that stand in direct contrast to what God has commanded us to. And we can obviously point at, yeah, that was wrong. That guy did that and that was wrong. But I think what this is talking about is something that's much, much more subtle. Because I wonder what would happen if several generations from now people look back on us. Would they see things in us that we do, that we think are normal, that we think are acceptable, that we think are okay, but will stand out like the nation of Israel worshiping another god? What do we do that will stand out in a couple generations? And that's a hard one, because in 2 Corinthians, Paul says this in chapter 6, verse 14. He says that do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? Being in the world isn't what's bad. Being in the world isn't what's bad. It's when we begin to yoke the two. When the world and our faith in Christ and following Jesus begins to look the same as the way of the world, then something is wrong. Because if we could look back and you can't tell the difference between your life and the life of people who don't follow and trust Jesus, then something is wrong. Something is wrong. Exodus 20, verse 3 is where we see the Ten Commandments. And the first one, right? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So it's this idea of having gods before you. And it kind of, I think it's easy for us to see sometimes the gods that are before us that we should take away. Those big, obvious things. But what this verse, when in the original Hebrew, when he's talking about the gods before me, it's not just before me. The way it's written, it says, you shall not have any other gods before me, beside me, anywhere near me. It says, I am a jealous God. Nothing anywhere close to me. And I think these gods that come up beside us, the things, the idols, the things that we trust more than Jesus, are often beside us, and so we have trouble seeing them. In Hosea 2:8, he's talking about Gomer again, and Hosea says this, she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold, which they used for the worship of Baal. It's hard to see because often it's the good things that we trust more than the one who gave us the good things. And what happens is we begin to take control and give credit to what we have done instead of how God has used all of these good things to bless us. We take control of it and we trust ourselves to do it more than what he has trusted us, or than trusting him. Robert Frost, I think, illustrates this well with the poem Road Not Taken. And he talks about how he wanders in a yellow wood and he comes across two paths. And down one, it is calm and straight. It says it's grassy, and he can see that it's well worn. And the other, he looks and he can't see where it goes beyond the bend in the thicket, I think is what it says. And what we do in those moments is we look down the path and we trust the path that we can see instead of trusting the path of following Jesus, which we don't always know where that leads, but we know it's good. There's this thing called the divine romance that plays into this. It's this idea that we long to be connected to our Savior. We long to be connected to our Creator. We have this desire within us to fulfill a purpose, to be fulfilled, to have the peace that Jesus brings. And when we come to that road, where when we turn to the left down the road that we can't really see where it goes, but we look ahead at the road that we can see where it goes, and it's grassy and clear, we end up trusting ourselves to find that fulfillment, to find that peace, to find that purpose. So we take the one we can see, and we work harder and harder, more and more, to try to fill that void, when all along the only way to find purpose is in him. Where Katie and I lived before was in coastal Virginia, and it's surrounded by military bases. And our church that we were at there was maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles from Langley Air Force Base and Langley NASA. And so we got to meet all sorts of crazy cool people, and people that are like 10,000 times cooler than me. And two of the families that became really dear to our hearts ended up moving, as military people do. And they were there in Langley, and one of them was a U-2 spy pilot, right? So he flew in space and had, as I understand it, when he retired, more hours in that plane than anyone else before him. So super cool dude. And he got moved to Beale Air Force Base, where the U-2s are stationed. And our other friend, Keith, he was an F-22 pilot, all right? So he's a fighter jet pilot. I mean, enough said, right? And he got moved out to Monterey, California, and they called us up maybe a year or two after they moved, and they said, hey, we want to see you guys. Jeff was getting ready to retire. They're like, we want to see you. We've got this terminal leave after Jeff retires. Can we take a week and get together? And we were like, yeah. So we went out to California to see them in Monterey. It was a tough gig. And so we go out to Monterey, and while we're there, we're having a great visit with all the families together. And one morning, the guys, me, Jeff, and Keith, decided to take a hike. And then in the afternoon, the girls were going to go to the beach, I think it was. And so we go on our hike, and I got to tell you, it was an intimidating hike. Going up in the mountains with Keith, who is an F-22 pilot. He's now actually the commander of the F-22s at Langley. He's got his name on the side of one of the jets, right? And not only that, he's run multiple marathons. He's run Ironmans. He's done all those like Tough Mudders and that sort of stuff. And then is Jeff, who's this spy plane pilot who has a goal of running a marathon in every state of our country, all right? And he's like more than halfway there from what I understand, all right? So getting ready to go hiking in the mountains with these two dudes, and it's like, these are marathon runners. These are extremely fit guys. I've watched marathons, but I've never done that, and I'm getting ready to it was intimidating. And we get to the top of the mountain, I'm huffing and puffing, and we sit down, and we start talking about life. And Jeff is sharing, like, yeah, I've just retired, and it's just like all these emotions of this long, good career in the Air Force and what he's going to do next. And his plans were to become a commercial pilot for American Airlines. So if you fly an American, you might meet him. And then Keith is still several years away from retirement, but we started talking, hey, Keith, what do you think you're going to do when you leave the military? And he looked at us and he's like, I got to be honest, guys. I'm terrified of that. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, what? You are, like, you've gone through survival training, you've flown jets all over the world, like, you're terrified of retiring? And he was like, yeah, man, I'm terrified of it. He's like, my whole life, since I've been 18, I went into the military, they told me what to do, I did it. They promoted me. The next time, they told me what to do. I did it. I did it well. They promoted me. I did it well. And I've just been following the person in front of me and doing what they've told me to do. He's like, the idea of having to figure that out, the idea of retiring and not knowing what I'm going to do is absolutely terrifying. And it's because that uncharted road of trusting God, of letting him have control, is scary. It is. We want to control. We want to take control of whatever is going on around us. We want to know what the outcome is going to be, and because we want to know what the outcome is going to be, we work harder and harder and harder, more and more and more, to try to shape the outcome to what we think it needs to be. And the truth is that the longer we work, the harder we work, we never reach that point where we feel fulfilled. It's this idea of the divine romance, this longing to be with the Creator, because what happens is we all long for it. We open up our hearts in a way that feels dangerous. And when you felt it, you know it. Because certain songs bring it back. That prone to wander brings it back for me. This idea of being completely humble, but completely confident. Because it's not about what I can do, because I know I'm nothing. Deep down inside, I know that I am nothing, but he has control. And it's those moments when we give up that control that we feel that connection. But what happens is that scares us. And so we settle. We start to trust what we can do over what he has done. We start to take control instead of letting him control. We start to take the lead instead of letting him lead. And when we settle, we begin to drift. Our identity begins to wander, and we begin to drift. And all of a sudden, what God has created to be good just sort of seems nice. And the evil that should startle us all of a sudden becomes normal. And we become content and okay with it. There's times when I've listened to music with students, and you listen to the song, and it's like, we need to turn this off. And they're like, why? And they're like, do you not hear what they just said? He's like, yeah, what's going on with that? It's startling because all of a sudden what stands out, what should stand out, becomes normal and it becomes acceptable. And we wander because we trust our identity, the identity that we can create, over the identity that he has given us as his son and as his daughter. Katie and I kind of ran into this a little bit when we moved here. So we bought a house 4 years ago with a 6-year plan of fixing it up, right? We bought it from the people that built it in 1940, and they had done nothing with it since, all right? So it had all sorts of ugly and all sorts of stuff that was way out of date. And we bought it because of the neighborhood. We loved the neighborhood, and we wanted to be in the neighborhood, and this was the way we could afford to be in the neighborhood. So we bought it with a 6-year plan. And when we felt the call to come here, to move here, we were on year 3 of our 6 years, all right, of fixing it up. And so we sat down and made the list, right, of all the things, the kitchen, there was just an overwhelming list. We'd look at it and we'd put it away and be like, we can't look at that right now. And as we started to talk about how we were going to do it, how we were going to handle the friends that were going to come help us, all that sort of stuff, we decided that we weren't going to work on Sundays. And for us, it was a step of trust. We wanted to trust God to take care of it. If God was moving us, then we needed to trust God to take care of it. So we did that. And for 5 weeks or so, 6 weeks or so, we worked Monday to Saturday. I would wake up at 5 in the morning sometimes and go try to finish a project before I left for work. And then when I'd get back, we'd be working until 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and then we'd repeat. And there was times, it always failed. I think God was testing us, if I'm honest. It seemed like every Saturday night, we'd get to a point on a project where all of a sudden, the kitchen sink didn't fit. The countertop didn't go in quite right, so I couldn't get it in. And then with no way the sink's getting in, right? And so we would have to go Sunday without a kitchen. We would be working on the bathroom and all of a sudden realize that the paint's not going to dry in time for us to put on the final coat. And if we take a shower and it gets all steamed up in the shower, we're going to we had a serious problem with peeling paint in that bathroom for whatever reason. We're like, we can't, so we would have a day without a bathroom. And it always seemed to land that way. 11 o'clock at night, Saturday night, we're like, we're not going to have a kitchen. whatever it was, we're not going to have a door. I mean, there was all sorts of things that come up. And it was this moment where we felt like God was calling us to trust him. And so we did. But then something shifted in me. And I don't know what it was. But towards the end, and it caused tension, we will say, between Katie and I. But towards the end, I forgot that. I wandered away from trusting him to take care of everything to me wanting to control how it ended. And from the day we took the pictures to trying to make sure everything was perfectly positioned and dusted so we could take these pictures, which who's going to see dust in a picture? And to when we listed it, and even when we listed it, we got into this discussion with our real estate agent, who's a good friend of ours, that we wanted to list it for $13,000 more than what he said we could sell it for. And so we got into this big discussion about it, and we listed it for $13,000 more than what he said. And we were confident in that. For whatever reason, that was a number that we felt we should sell it for, and so we were confident in that. And then you list it, and you see the listing on Zillow or whatever it is, and you're like, oh, it's never going to sell. He said it would be sold for so much less, it's never going to sell. And all of a sudden, we got calls. And within a day, we had like 4 or 5 viewings, right? And the first one, made an offer. And when we're getting ready to receive the offer, it's like we were told we're receiving it, and we're like, oh, great, this is going to be awful. You know, they're going to list it for less than what he said we could get it for. And all of a sudden, we get this offer, and it's for $4,000 more than what we listed it for, because they didn't want to deal with anything else. They just wanted us to accept the offer and be done. And so we were like, it was like one of those kicks, like, hey, Tim, I got it. Just trust me. And it was a military couple that was buying it, so they had a VA loan, which VA loans have a lot of different inspections that they have to go through for the home. And every inspection, I was driving Katie nuts, because the night before the inspection, I would literally be outside with a headlamp, being like, oh, I see a point, I see a crack in the, I'm going to point that real quick. Or I should probably cock that window again. Or literally until 11 o'clock at night, I'm outside with my headlamp doing silly things that no one's going to notice for every one of the inspections. And every time the inspection would come back, fine. The VA inspection, which we were told everybody has something go wrong with the VA inspection, just expect it, and we'll take care of it. Not a thing came back. And it was the whole time, I was like, I'm trying to take control. I want to fix this. I want to make sure it goes through right. So I'm doing everything I can. I'm trying to take control of this situation. And every time it was like, God just looked at me and went, hey, Tim, I got it. It's okay. And it was time after time after time of that whole process that I kept trying to take control. And every time, God would just come to me and say, I've got it. Calm down. I've got it. And that's kind of a silly example in comparison to some other things, I think. These times when we put other things beside God, instead of putting God at the forefront. And some examples maybe. Our pursuit of our careers. Are they something that we seek to fulfill us? Or do we seek them to honor God through what we do? Our view of money and possessions. Do they reflect a kingdom perspective? Or is it in pursuit of personal gain? Our addiction to the next better, best, bigger thing. Does that reflect the peace that Christ gives us? Or are we consumed with looking good in our own comfort? Does our temporary view of marriage align with God's view or our own? Do our family values center around reflecting his kingdom, or does it center around pursuing the American dream and our children? It's these good things, right? It's good to work. Sorry. It's good to work. Our families are good. These things that God has blessed us with are good. They're not bad, but what happens is all of a sudden we trust in those more than we trust God. Or sometimes maybe the same that we trust God. And it's hard to tell the difference between what we're trusting more and who's controlling what. And it's when those gods, those idols, those things that we put beside God take control, that something is wrong and we begin to drift. And what is good starts to feel like what is nice, and what should be startlingly bad all of a sudden becomes normal. And it comes out in our identity. Whoops, sorry. We must acknowledge that something is wrong, that we are broken. And it's not just in the big sins that are obvious, but it's in the way that we live our life, the way that we trust and control. God is obsessed with us trusting him and us following him. And we need to let go of control. We need to let him trust, or let our hearts trust him more than what we can see. Because wandering comes at a price. Hosea 2:7 says, she will chase after other lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. She will chase after other lovers, but not catch them. She will look for them, but not find them. There's this thing called the paradox of hedonism. And it's this idea that the harder you try to find happiness, the further it goes away from you. These things that we pursue outside of Christ, these times when we take control, what we're doing is pursuing a promise that these things, these good things, will deliver the purpose, will deliver the fulfillment, will deliver the peace that Christ has given us. But they always fall short. They always fall short. And we find ourselves having to work harder, to do more, to spin the wheels even more, to find ourselves in this point of chaos because we can't figure out how to do enough in order to gain enough control. And the truth is there's never enough time. There's never enough money. There's never enough sex. There's never enough square footage. There's never enough toys. There's never enough cars. There's never enough whatever it is. There's never enough. And we will always find ourselves spinning. Other lovers demand something from us. Gomer pursued other lovers, and she ended up a slave. We see in Hosea 3 that she was on a slave. She was getting auctioned off as a slave. And we become enslaved by our other lovers. We want to put on the fronts that we've got it all good, right? Especially when we come to church on Sunday. We want to act like we got it all together. But if we're honest, a lot of us are just dying inside, constantly grasping to try to find the next thing that will give us that purpose, that will fulfill us in that way. We walk around in tense balls of anxiety because we've put all of our energy into things that we realize won't fulfill us, instead of just stepping back and taking that road that bends across the thicket and trusting him. We put so much focus on ourselves that we can't see God through it. I don't know what it is, but I have these random conversations that happen at like the most awkward and inappropriate times. Katie says it's the beard. Not inappropriate, but just weird times, unexpected times. Katie says it's the beard. She says it either diffuses people or it causes people to put their guard up, that you can't be neutral. I don't know. But it just happens to me. The other day, a couple weeks before we moved, I was getting done kayaking. It was about 1 a.m. I kept staying out because I kept hoping I'd catch a fish, and I didn't. So about 1 a.m, I'm rolling in, pull my kayak back next to the dock, and this guy comes up that's getting ready to take out as well, and he just starts talking to me about life. He starts talking about his marriage and how it's falling apart, and it's just weird. Those things just happen for whatever reason. And I had that happen again Friday night. Friday night, Katie and the kids went down to Tennessee, and they were visiting Katie's family in Tennessee, and I had Friday night, and I was like, what am I going to do? And he was like, you know what? I've been wanting to buy a compound bow. I've been saving up money for it. I want to go look at some compound bows at Field & Stream. So I went down to Field & Stream, and I start talking to the salesman, and we go, and he's letting me shoot a couple of the bows, and we're talking about it. And all of a sudden he starts, I ask him why he got into archery. And he starts talking about how he just needed to find a place to find peace. And I was like, okay. He's like, before I did this, he's like, I did this thing called a sensory deprivation tank. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. I hadn't. So I was like, what's that? And he was like, well, what we do is you get this big tank, and you fill it up with Epsom salt and a little bit of water so that it's like this slurry that you can float in. You can't sink. You can just float in it and just be there floating in this tank. And I was like, okay. And he's like, and then they shut the lid on the tank, and you're in this tank where you can't hear anything, you can't see anything, and you're just floating for about an hour. And I was like, okay. And he's like, and it either freaks you out or it brings this super cool peace because you're just still and quiet and this moment is in. And I was like, all right. So why'd you get into archery? And he's like, oh, well, it's expensive and I couldn't afford to keep doing it. So I heard this thing about how shooting bow and arrow is kind of like this Zen moment. And so I got into archery for that. And I was like, all right. And we start talking more and more and more. And what I realized was this guy had a ton of hurt, a ton of pain, and he was trying to figure out how to escape it. We started talking about his family, and he lost a child at birth. And it still was very painful for him as we were talking about it. And he was doing all of these things to try to find peace, to try to find that sense of everything's going to be all right. And he kept going from thing to thing to thing. And that seems a little dramatic maybe, but it was like, man, there's something so much better. There's something so much better for you, for all of us, than constantly spinning our wheels to try to figure out where to find peace, to try to figure out where to find fulfillment. Here's a cool thing about this story in Hosea. In chapter 3, we find Hosea on the auction block, getting ready to be sold as a slave. But Hosea doesn't let that happen. Hosea sells what he has, gives what money he has, and the way it's written, he didn't even have enough money for it, but he also had to give his food. So he gave his food and his money and what he had to buy Gomer back. Just as God buys us back. Even though Gomer wandered and left Hosea and said, I don't trust you to provide for me, he bought her back and brought her back into his life. And there's a prelude to how God is doing this for us too in Hosea. It's in chapter 2, verse 14 through 23. And what's neat about this is that it's all of a sudden the tone goes from Hosea talking to Gomer to God talking to us. And in verse 14, it says, therefore I will lure her and speak tenderly to her. God wants to speak to our heart is what he's saying. And then the next thing in 15 and 18, God, he gives her back her vineyards. The bow and sword, it says, in battle I will abolish from the land. God is promising her safety and security. And then the last thing, God renews his marriage vows. He renews his marriage vows. He said, I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you will know the Lord. 3 times he says it. To Gomer, who has wandered, who has gone back to prostitution, who has gone back to being used and abused over trusting God, he calls her back and says, I'm renewing my marriage vows with you. 3 times. I will betroth you to me. I will betroth you to me. I will betroth you to me. And what's cool about the way it ends, he says, and you will know the Lord. And that know is the biblical sense of the word know. Not just have knowledge, but it's an intimate, personal, connected. You will know me. I love you too much to leave you on the auction block is what he's saying. And I'm going to send Jesus for you. All you have to do is follow Jesus. Trust Jesus. Give control to Jesus. Hosea pays the price for Gomer's wandering. And God has paid the price for our wandering. There's an ESPN article that came out this week for Michael Jordan. I don't know if you guys have heard of him, but he's kind of famous. He was a basketball player for the Chicago Bulls, right? He has 6 national championships rings. He's ridiculous, right? He's a Hall of Famer. Everyone knows him. He can walk into any room and everybody in the room would know who he is. Even as a kid, right, playing basketball, there was the phrase, I want to be like Mike. And it was true, right? We all wanted, everybody looked up to him playing basketball. They wanted to be like that. They wanted to be good like that. And then in this article, Michael Jordan was talking to this author, and he said this. He said, how can I enjoy the next 20 years without so much of this, referring to basketball, consuming me? How can I find peace away from the game of basketball? How can I find peace away from the game of basketball? This man who has, by our standards, everything, who has achieved the pinnacle of the sport, finds himself looking back going, how can I ever find peace without that? He achieved it, right? These things that we constantly go for, he's achieved it. He's got more money than he knows what to do with. He has more fame than almost anybody. And he still finds himself wanting more, because that he has found to be lacking. Everything in this world is lacking. There was an article online by a group called the Gospel Coalition that responded to this article about Michael Jordan, and the author said this. He said, "Michael, you have never had peace. Triumph and fame, yes, but not peace. James Naismith invented a game that brought you a sense of purpose, a sense of value, a sense of calm. But it was only that. It was only a sense, a counterfeit of the real thing. It's not there. It's not in the world. Status is tethered to performance in the world, and it's the same in the gospel. The difference, however, is that it's not our status as believers, it's not tethered to our performance, but Christ's. Only the gospel can offer the resources to combat our pride, expose our emptiness, and flood our hearts with that peace. The world is lacking, but Jesus is not. What he has done on the cross for us is paid that price so that we can be in a relationship with him, so that we can have that fulfillment, so we can have that purpose, so we can have the peace that only he can give. One of the scriptures that's up there during communion says this, and this is what I want to end with. It says, it's in 1 Peter chapter 1. It says, though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with the inexpressible joy and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. We need to stop running. We need to stop trusting ourselves, stop taking control, and trust Jesus. Trust what he has done, because it is good, it is better, and it is the only place we're going to find peace. If today you need that peace, I want to encourage you to come talk to me up here, come talk to Darren, talk to somebody about it. Don't delay. Don't keep wandering and don't keep trying to trust yourself. We need to drop our pride and trust in him. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing. Lord, I thank you for your word, for the way your word speaks, for the way your word breaks down our hearts, breaks down our pride, and causes us to come to you humbly, but in a joyful, inexpressible way. Lord, I pray right now that we can come to you, that we can drop our pride, and that we can rest in the peace that you give, that we won't keep trying to work it, but that we will rest in you. And it's your son's name we pray. Amen.